And what was she about to reveal? The room felt colder now, the tension between the officers and the woman thickening with every passing second. Elizabeth pressed her hand against the glass, her breath fogging up the surface. Her heart raced as she watched the women's smug expression. It was clear that she knew something important, but she wasn't going to make it easy for anyone to uncover the truth. The detective leaned forward, his voice commanding as he spoke to the woman. "We know you were with Daniel Webb when John Reynolds died, and we know that you're hiding something. We need you to tell us everything." The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her cold eyes locking onto the detective's. "You think you know everything? You don't even know half of it. John wasn't just some victim. He wasn't just a random guy that got caught up in this. He had a part in it. A big part." Elizabeth's stomach twisted. What was she saying? John had been involved in this? What had John done that had led to his own death? "Tell us what you mean," Detective Green said, his voice controlled but firm. The woman leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying the attention. "John, he wasn't who you thought he was. You think he was some kind of saint, a man who just got caught up in something bad. But he wasn't. He was part of a bigger game. And Daniel and I? We were just pawns in his plan." Elizabeth felt a chill creep up her spine. What was she talking about? Was John really that different from the man she thought she knew? The woman continued, her voice low and laced with venom. "John played both sides, you see. He had this whole act down, being the perfect husband, the perfect man. But underneath it all, he was a liar. He used people. And when Daniel came back into the picture, it was because John needed something from him." Detective Green's expression remained stoic, but Elizabeth could tell that he was absorbing every word. This was the lead they had been waiting for, but it only raised more questions. "Are you saying John manipulated Daniel?" Green asked, leaning forward. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced over at the one-way mirror, as though aware of Elizabeth's presence. Her eyes softened for a moment, but it wasn't sympathy that she offered. It was something darker, something that made Elizabeth's heart skip a beat. "You think John was innocent?" the woman finally asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think he didn't deserve what happened to him, after everything he did?" Elizabeth's pulse quickened. She felt like she was suffocating under the weight of the woman's words. Had John really been involved in something this twisted? What had she missed all those years? What did he do? Elizabeth whispered aloud, though she wasn't sure if anyone would hear her. The woman's eyes locked onto hers through the glass, her smile widening. "You'll never believe it. But John wasn't just involved with Daniel. He was involved with a whole network. A network of people, dangerous people. He was their contact. He was their way in." Elizabeth's knees buckled as the realization began to sink in. Her mind reeled, unable to process the enormity of what the woman was saying. John had been involved with dangerous people? What kind of world had her husband been a part of, and why had he kept her so far from it? "You're lying," Elizabeth whispered, her voice breaking. "John was nothing like that." The woman let out a bitter laugh. "Believe what you want, but I know the truth. I know what John was really like. And you," she paused, her eyes flickering with a cruel kind of satisfaction. "You're just another pawn in this mess, just like I was." Elizabeth couldn't take it anymore. She turned away from the glass, her mind spinning. She stumbled down the hallway, desperate for air, desperate to think. She needed to get out of this building, away from these people, away from the suffocating atmosphere that felt like it was closing in on her. As she stepped outside into the cold night air, the world around her seemed distant, surreal. Her thoughts were jumbled, her heart racing with every new revelation. John had been involved with dangerous people? How had she not known? How had she missed all the signs? And who else was involved in this twisted web? She leaned against the side of the police car, trying to steady her breath. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. But within her, chaos raged. Everything she thought she knew about John had just been shattered. Detective Green appeared beside her, his expression grave. "Elizabeth, I need you to stay calm. We're getting closer to the truth. But right now, we have to focus. We need to figure out who else is involved in this." Elizabeth barely heard him. Her mind kept returning to one thought. One question. What had John done? The detective sighed, rubbing his temples. I know this is hard, but you have to understand, whatever was happening with John, it's not your fault. He made choices, but we'll find out what those choices were. Elizabeth nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to believe him, but a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that everything had been a lie. The man she had married, the man she had thought she knew, was he really the person she had thought he was? Or had she been blind to his secrets, just as she was now blind to the full picture of what had happened? As Detective Green turned to walk back toward the building, Elizabeth lingered, staring out into the night. She couldn't stop thinking about the woman's words. John had been a part of something bigger, a network, a dangerous world. And now, it seemed like she was trapped in that world, too, whether she wanted to be or not. She felt a sudden urge to find out more, to confront the truth head-on, even if it meant digging deeper into the darkness John had left behind. But as she took a step forward, something stopped her. A flash of movement caught her eye in the distance. She blinked, trying to focus, but it was gone. Just a shadow disappearing into the night. Was it a person? Has someone seen her? Elizabeth's heart began to race again. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Elizabeth stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The shadow she'd seen in the distance had vanished, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She scanned the street around her, the headlights of passing cars casting long shadows on the cracked pavement, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone lurking in the dark. "You're imagining things," she whispered to herself, trying to calm the growing anxiety in her chest. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. She knew someone had been there. She could feel it. She turned to go back inside the station, her legs shaky, but before she could take a step, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart jumping into her throat when she saw the message. It was from an unknown number. "Don't trust the cops. They're hiding something. I'll tell you the truth. Meet me." Elizabeth's fingers trembled as she stared at the text. Who could this be? Another person involved in whatever dark world John had been a part of? Was it Daniel Webb? Or someone else? She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. The street was still empty, eerily silent. With one last look toward the police station, Elizabeth made a snap decision. She had to find out more. She had to meet whoever this was and get the truth, whatever it was. Her mind raced as she hurried toward her car. The message had unsettled her, but there was a part of her, a part she couldn't ignore, that needed to know what was really going on. She couldn't live in the dark any longer. As she drove through the quiet streets, she kept looking over her shoulder, half expecting someone to follow her. The message had rattled her, but it had also given her a sense of urgency. Whoever this was, they knew something important, something that could change everything. The address in the message led her to a rundown part of town, where the buildings seemed abandoned and the streetlights flickered. She parked in a dark alley, the headlights of her car casting long shadows against the crumbling walls. Her palms were sweaty as she grabbed her purse and stepped out of the car. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. Her footsteps echoed against the pavement, and the distant hum of the city felt miles away. Elizabeth hesitated before walking toward the location. The building ahead was old, its windows broken, and the door hanging off its hinges. It was the kind of place that screamed danger. She had no idea who she was meeting or what kind of person they were, but curiosity and fear drove her forward. As she reached the door, she knocked softly. No response. She knocked again, this time a little louder. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. "Come in," a voice called from the shadows. It was low, almost mechanical. Elizabeth stepped inside, her heart racing in her chest. The hallway was narrow and smelled of damp and decay. Her shoes clicked against the worn wooden floor as she walked deeper into the building. The air felt thick, heavy with something she couldn't quite place. Tension, maybe. She turned the corner and entered a small room. At the far end of the room, a figure was seated at a table, facing away from her. The man's silhouette was barely visible in the low light, but she could make out the outline of his face, his sharp features casting long shadows. "Who are you?" Elizabeth asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Her nerves were shot, but she had to remain calm. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned slowly, his face coming into the light. Elizabeth gasped as she recognized him. It was Daniel Webb. He wasn't the angry, violent man she had imagined. In fact, he looked tired, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. His hair was disheveled, and his clothes were torn, as if he had been living in the streets. He looked like someone who had seen too much, someone broken. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low, almost sympathetic. "You came." She swallowed hard. "What is this? Why are you here? What do you want with me?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared at her with a look of resignation in his eyes. "I know you want answers. You're looking for the truth about John. But trust me, you're not going to like what you hear." Elizabeth stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "Tell me everything. I don't care what it is. I need to know the truth. About John. About everything." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You think you knew him. You think you had this perfect life with him, this ideal marriage. But John was never who you thought he was. He was hiding from something, hiding from me, from the people he was really working with." Elizabeth felt a cold chill settle over her. "What are you talking about? What did John do? Why didn't he tell me anything?" Daniel stood up, his eyes darting around the room, as if making sure they weren't being watched. John wasn't just an innocent guy caught in a bad situation. He was part of a network of people who were doing things, terrible things. He was an informant. He worked with the cops, but he also had deals with people on the other side of the law. Dangerous people. People who don't just let you walk away. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. "You're saying John was working with criminals?" Daniel nodded slowly. "He didn't tell you, did he? Not about what he had to do. Not about the people he had to deal with. You were just a cover for him. A perfect little wife. But everything he did, it all came back to haunt him." Elizabeth felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet. "So, what happened? What did he do to make them kill him?" Daniel's face darkened, his voice dropping lower. "John tried to walk away. He wanted out. But you don't just get out of something like that. They made sure he wouldn't be able to." Elizabeth's mind was spinning. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. John, the man she had loved, had been involved in this dangerous world all along. And now it seemed that the very people he had tried to escape from had finally caught up with him. She wanted to scream, to demand more answers, but the words caught in her throat. Who are these people? Who killed him? Daniel's gaze hardened. "They'll come for you too, if they think you know too much. You should have never come here." Elizabeth's pulse spiked. The room suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. "What do you mean? Who are they? Tell me." But before Daniel could answer, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deeper in the building. The door to the room slammed open, and a group of masked figures stormed in, their faces obscured by dark cloths. "You should have listened," one of them growled. Elizabeth's breath froze in her chest. Everything she had been searching for, all the answers, had just led her straight into the heart of danger. And now, it was too late to turn back. The room seemed to shrink around Elizabeth as the masked figures stormed in, their presence suffocating. The air felt thick with hostility, and she could hear her own heart pounding in her ears. For a moment, she was frozen, her mind racing for some way out, some way to escape this nightmare. The leader of the group, tall and imposing, stepped forward. His eyes glinted through the slits in his mask, cold and unfeeling. He didn't speak immediately, just studied her with a look that made Elizabeth's blood run cold. It was the same look of someone who had already made up their mind about you, someone who wasn't going to give you a second chance. Daniel stepped back, his face filled with what could only be described as defeat. He seemed like he knew exactly what was coming. The terror Elizabeth felt, the sense of helplessness, it was nothing compared to the fear in Daniel's eyes. "Daniel," Elizabeth whispered, her voice shaking, "what is this? What are they going to do?" But Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he just shook his head, a faint but bitter smile tugging at his lips. "You should have listened, Elizabeth," he said, his voice hollow. "This was never going to end well." The masked leader held up his hand, signaling to the others. One of the figures grabbed Elizabeth by the arm, pulling her toward the center of the room. She gasped, struggling to free herself, but it was no use. Their grip was too strong. They were professionals, whoever they were, and they knew exactly how to control her. "Let her go," Daniel shouted, his voice hoarse. "She doesn't know anything. She's just—" The leader's voice cut him off. "She knows more than enough. We can't have her going around asking too many questions." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about John anymore. This was about her, and she could feel it in her bones. If she didn't get out of here, she was going to end up just like John. Her mind raced, her thoughts a blur. Think. What could she do? She had no weapon, no way out, and the people surrounding her were ruthless. The leader stepped closer, his presence overpowering. "You should have stayed out of this, Elizabeth," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But now that you're here, you can't leave." A cold chill washed over her as the realization hit. They were going to kill her. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't some kind of negotiation. They had no intention of letting her walk out of here alive. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. She couldn't die. She wouldn't let them win. She had to survive, had to get the truth out, no matter the cost. But how? What could she possibly do against these people? In that moment of desperation, a small sliver of hope appeared. She remembered her phone, still in her pocket. Maybe, just maybe, if she could get to it, she could call for help. If she could just stall long enough. The leader nodded to one of the masked figures, and the man reached for something in his pocket, a gun. Elizabeth's breath hitched. This was it. There was no way out. But just as the man raised the gun, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the building. The sound of gunfire. Footsteps. Shouting. The masked figures froze, their attention split. For a brief moment, Elizabeth saw her chance. She couldn't waste it. Without thinking, she jerked her arm free from the grip of the man holding her, and in the split second of confusion, she dove toward the door. "Run!" Daniel screamed. "Get out of here!" She didn't have to be told twice. Her heart pounding in her chest, Elizabeth bolted toward the hallway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear the masked figures shouting behind her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. This was her chance to escape. She ran through the dark, narrow halls, her footsteps echoing as she turned corner after corner. She didn't know where she was going, just that she had to get out. She had to find her way back to the street, back to safety. Another gunshot rang out, the sound echoing through the walls, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to keep running, to keep pushing forward, no matter what. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elizabeth burst through a door and out into the open air. She stumbled into the alley, gasping for breath, her legs weak from the sprint. But she didn't stop. She kept running, her eyes scanning the dark streets for any sign of help. And then, just as she thought she might collapse from exhaustion, headlights pierced the darkness. A car, coming toward her. Before she could even register the relief that washed over her, the car screeched to a halt beside her. The door flew open, and someone inside shouted, "Get in!" Elizabeth didn't need any more encouragement. She dove into the car, slamming the door behind her. "Drive!" she yelled at the driver, her voice frantic. "Please, just drive." The car sped off into the night, and Elizabeth turned around to look out the back window. The building she had just escaped from was fading into the distance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. Whoever these people were, they wouldn't stop. They would come after her. They had to. As the car sped down the street, Elizabeth collapsed back into the seat, her hands trembling in her lap. Her heart was still racing, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. She was alive, for now, but she had no idea who to trust anymore. The world she thought she knew, the life she had shared with John, had been a lie. And the truth? It was far darker than she could have ever imagined. "Are you okay?" the driver asked, his voice concerned. Elizabeth looked up at him, her breath still shallow. She didn't recognize him. He was just a stranger, a figure in the darkness who had appeared when she needed him most. "I don't know," she whispered. "I'm not sure I'll ever be okay again." As the car sped away, Elizabeth realized that she wasn't just running from the people who had tried to kill her. She was running from the truth. A truth so terrifying, so dangerous, that she wasn't sure anyone could survive it. But she had to find it. She had to uncover the full story of what had happened to John, of what he had been involved in, no matter the cost. And somehow, she knew, deep down, that the worst was still yet to come. Elizabeth swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't know where to begin, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life was about to change again. The answers she needed were just out of reach, and the truth behind John's death was more complicated and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The room felt suffocating as Detective Green and Officer Scarr stood before her, their eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to respond. Elizabeth's mind swirled in a blur of confusion. Daniel Webb, a name she had never heard of before. A name now tied to her husband's mysterious death. Why had John never mentioned him? Was Daniel Webb some part of John's past he had tried to forget? Or was there something far more sinister at play? Elizabeth tried to steady her breath, but it was impossible. Her chest was tight, and her hands were still trembling from the shock of the last few hours. The officers waited for her to say something, anything that might give them the answers they needed. But she had nothing. Nothing except 1,000 questions. I don't know who Daniel Webb is, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I've never heard that name before. Detective Green narrowed his eyes, as though trying to gauge whether she was telling the truth. Are you sure, Elizabeth? John never said anything about him? Not once. Elizabeth shook her head vigorously. No, I swear, I didn't know about him. If John had a past with him, he never told me. We didn't talk about his past much. He didn't like to. The detective exchanged a look with Officer Scarr. That's strange, Officer Scarr muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. We've dug through everything. There's nothing about Daniel Webb in John's recent history. But if he was close to John before, why would he suddenly show up now? Elizabeth's heart pounded as she thought about the possibilities. If Daniel Webb had been a friend of John's in the past, why hadn't John shared that with her? And if this man had come back into John's life, could it have had something to do with the arguments she'd heard before? Was there a connection between John's transition and whatever history Daniel had with him? Her thoughts were interrupted when Detective Green's phone rang, the sharp sound cutting through the thick silence in the room. He glanced at the screen before answering. Green here. Elizabeth sat still, trying not to look too anxious as she listened to the one-sided conversation. The detective's voice remained calm, but the tension in his shoulders told her it was important. What do you mean he's gone? Detective Green's tone sharpened. That's impossible. We just traced his location. How could he be gone? Elizabeth's stomach dropped. Was Daniel Webb somehow already on the run? Had he been warned? The thought made her stomach churn. If he had something to do with John's death, then there was no telling what kind of danger he posed. And now, the police were saying he was missing. Detective Green hung up the phone, his face grim. We have a problem, he said, looking at Elizabeth with concern. Daniel Webb has disappeared. The lead we had on him just slipped through our fingers. Elizabeth's heart raced. If Daniel Webb was involved in John's death and now he was gone, what did that mean for her? The walls were closing in on her, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of it all pressing down on her. What if the police couldn't find him? What if they thought she was involved, and the truth never came to light? Where did he go? She asked, her voice tight with anxiety. We don't know yet, Detective Green replied, his tone flat. But if he's connected to John's death, we need to find him. Fast. Elizabeth stood up, suddenly feeling claustrophobic in the small room. I need to know more about this Daniel Webb. I can't help you if you don't tell me everything. The detective hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. I'm not sure you're ready for that. Elizabeth's eyes widened. What do you mean? What is it you're not telling me? Why is Daniel Webb so important? Detective Green's gaze softened for a moment, but the hard edge returned quickly. Because Daniel Webb isn't just anyone from John's past. He was once a part of John's life in ways that go far beyond a simple friendship. This man, he was involved in a relationship with John. A very complicated, very dangerous relationship. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. A relationship? John had never told her about any past relationships, let alone something dangerous. This was all coming too fast, and her mind was struggling to keep up. Could this be the reason for their sudden argument? Was John hiding something much darker than she could imagine? Was Daniel Webb violent? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Violent? Detective Green repeated, his eyes hardening. You have no idea. This man has a history of trouble. We're talking about a guy with a record. He's been in and out of prison, involved in some serious criminal activity. And now, he's disappeared. After John was killed, Elizabeth felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. She had known John had secrets, but she never imagined they could be this dark. How could he have been involved with someone like that? What had she married into? I didn't know, she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't know any of this. We know, Detective Green said, his tone softening for a moment. And right now, that's not what's important. What's important is that we find Daniel Webb. He's the key to this whole case. If we can track him down, we'll have the answers we're looking for. Elizabeth nodded, her heart heavy with fear and confusion. She had never been more scared in her life. John was gone, murdered, and the man who might have done it was nowhere to be found. And the longer Daniel Webb stayed hidden, the further she was from the truth. As the detective and officer left the room to continue their search for Daniel, Elizabeth was left alone with her thoughts. Her mind raced through the endless possibilities, but she kept coming back to one question. What if Daniel Webb wasn't the only person hiding secrets? Suddenly, she felt a chill wash over her. What if someone else had been involved in John's death? What if there was more to this story than even the police could uncover? And what if she was the only one who knew the truth? Elizabeth sat back in the interrogation room, her mind spinning with everything she had learned so far. Daniel Webb, a name she had never heard until today, but now it seemed to haunt her thoughts. He wasn't just some random person from John's past. He was someone tied to John in ways Elizabeth couldn't even begin to understand. The idea that this man, who might have had a violent history, was linked to her husband's death felt like a cruel twist of fate. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to organize the chaos in her head. John had always been so secretive about his past. But why? Why hadn't he told her about Daniel Webb? Was this the kind of man John had been involved with before? If so, what did that mean for her? Elizabeth had to force herself to breathe. The detective had made it clear that Daniel Webb was their main lead. But what if he never showed up? What if the man was gone for good, and all they had left were unanswered questions? The door to the room creaked open, and Elizabeth quickly wiped away the tears that had started to gather in her eyes. She hadn't realized how much she was hurting until now. It felt like her entire world was crashing down. Detective Green stepped in, his face tense but focused. He looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and determination, like he wanted to help, but also like he didn't quite trust her yet. We've got some more information, Detective Green said, pulling out a folder and sitting down across from her. We found out more about Daniel Webb's past, and about his connection to John. Elizabeth straightened in her chair, her pulse quickening. What do you mean? The detective didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the folder in front of him and slid a piece of paper toward her. It was a photograph. The image was old, faded, and it took Elizabeth a moment to recognize what she was looking at. It was a photo of John, her John, standing with a man she didn't recognize. The man looked younger, more youthful in the photo, and his face held a sly smile that made Elizabeth's stomach churn. Is this Daniel Webb? She asked, pointing to the man beside John. Yes, Detective Green replied. This was taken back when they were in their early 20s. We found it in one of John's old things. It seems Daniel was more than just a friend to him. They were involved, romantically too. Elizabeth's heart sank. John had never mentioned being in a relationship before. This felt like an entirely new side to him, a side she couldn't possibly have imagined. Why had he kept all of this from her? Why hadn't he told her about Daniel? Was this the real reason behind their argument? Were they close? Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The detective hesitated for a moment. They were close, but it wasn't a peaceful relationship. From what we've gathered, Daniel was controlling, manipulative. Their relationship was toxic, and it ended badly. Very badly. Elizabeth's throat tightened. What do you mean? What happened? Detective Green leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. Daniel Webb didn't just fade out of John's life. According to some old friends, he became violent when John tried to end things. There were threats. There were fights. John even had to get a restraining order against him. Elizabeth's mind reeled. You're telling me John was involved with someone who was dangerous? And he never told me? It seems that way, the detective replied. But this is where things get complicated. Daniel didn't just disappear after that. He reappeared in John's life a few weeks ago, shortly before John's death. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. He came back? Yes, the detective said, nodding grimly. It seems Daniel contacted John, and they started talking again. We don't know exactly what happened during that time, but it seems like they tried to reconcile, or at least, that's what John might have thought. Elizabeth felt the weight of everything crashing down on her. John had been trying to reconnect with Daniel, this violent, toxic person from his past. What had he been thinking? And why hadn't he told her any of this? Did you find out what happened when Daniel came back into John's life? Elizabeth asked, her voice shaky. We're still piecing it together, Detective Green replied. But we think this is when things started to spiral. The argument you heard might have been about Daniel, about his return, about the past they shared. But it didn't end with words. We believe Daniel was involved in some way. We can't prove it yet, but we're working on it. Elizabeth's head was spinning. So, you think Daniel came back, and it led to an argument between me and John? But that doesn't explain the murder. You still think I killed him? Detective Green studied her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. No, we don't think you killed him, but we think Daniel did. Or at least, we think Daniel was there. We need to find him. Elizabeth felt a cold chill wash over her. If Daniel had killed John, it wasn't just a simple murder. It was something deeper, something much darker. Daniel had come back, and it seemed like his return had set off a chain of events that Elizabeth could never have predicted. But the real question remained. Why had Daniel killed John? Was it really because of their toxic relationship? Or was there something else at play here? Before she could ask another question, Officer Scar entered the room. His face was grim as he held up a phone. We got a hit, he said, his voice urgent. We found him. We know where Daniel Webb is. Elizabeth's heart leapt. Was this it? Was this the moment they could finally get some answers? Where is he? She asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. He's not far, Officer Scar replied. We're moving in now. Elizabeth felt a rush of relief, but it was short-lived. As the officers quickly left the room to prepare for the capture, she sat there alone with her thoughts. Daniel Webb was about to be found, but would he have the answers she so desperately needed? And what if, just like everything else in this twisted mess, the truth was more complicated and far more dangerous than she could ever imagine? The air outside the police station felt heavy as Detective Green and Officer Scar raced through the hallways, their steps echoing off the cold concrete floors. Elizabeth followed behind them, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't keep up with them, but her mind raced faster than her feet. She had so many questions, too many questions. But right now, the most important one was the simplest. Where was Daniel Webb? And what was he going to do when they found him? The officers had received word of his location, an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, the kind of place no one would ever bother to go unless they had something to hide. And Daniel Webb had plenty to hide. Elizabeth could feel it in her bones. If he was involved in John's death, then the answers she was desperately searching for might be locked away with him. The drive to the location was a blur. Elizabeth's mind kept replaying every moment from the past few days, trying to piece together the puzzle that seemed to grow more tangled with every passing minute. Daniel Webb, John's old lover, his dangerous past, had been involved in John's death somehow. But why? Why would someone kill the person they once cared for? And how much of John's life had Elizabeth truly not known? When they arrived at the abandoned building, the officers didn't waste any time. They pulled their weapons and moved swiftly into position, signaling Elizabeth to stay back. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched them move toward the door, their faces tense, their movements precise. The building was silent, too silent. Elizabeth felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. What if Daniel was ready for them? What if he was armed? She had no idea what kind of person Daniel Webb was anymore, but one thing was clear. He was dangerous. "Stay here," Detective Green said, his voice firm. "We're going in. You don't need to see this." Elizabeth nodded numbly, standing on the edge of the yard, clutching her arms to her chest. She couldn't help herself. She was terrified, but she couldn't look away. She needed answers. She needed to understand why John had been killed. Minutes passed like hours, and still, there was no sign of anyone. The wind howled through the broken windows of the building, and Elizabeth could feel the chill settle deep into her bones. Every second stretched out, her anticipation building with each breath she took. Then, a shot rang out. Elizabeth gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She had no idea who had fired, but she didn't have to wait long to find out. Detective Green came rushing out of the building, his face pale and grim. "Get back in the car," he said sharply, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the police vehicle. Now, Elizabeth's heart raced as she stumbled to keep up with him. "What happened? What's going on? Did you find him?" "Not exactly," the detective said, his voice tight. "We found Daniel, but he wasn't alone." Elizabeth froze, her mind struggling to process his words. "What do you mean? Who else was there?" Detective Green didn't answer immediately. He motioned for Officer Scarr, who quickly joined them by the car. His face was just as grim as the detective's. "We found Daniel Webb, but he was with someone," Officer Scarr said. "A woman." Elizabeth's stomach twisted. "A woman? Who could it be?" "She wasn't just with him," Officer Scarr continued, his voice low. "She was his accomplice, and she had a gun." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. A woman? Who was she? How was she connected to all of this? "We don't know everything yet," Detective Green said, "but we've got them in custody. They'll talk. They have to." Elizabeth felt a mixture of relief and dread. At least they had Daniel Webb. At least they could finally get some answers. But the idea of another person being involved, someone she hadn't even known about, made her feel more lost than ever. Is she the one who killed John?" Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible. The detective hesitated. "We don't know, but we'll find out." Elizabeth nodded, her hands trembling. "I need to know everything. I need to understand why this happened." The drive back to the station was quick, but it felt like an eternity. Elizabeth sat in the back of the patrol car, her thoughts racing. Every possibility seemed to race through her mind. Who was this woman? What was her connection to Daniel Webb? And why had she been involved in John's death? When they arrived back at the station, they immediately took Daniel Webb and the woman into separate interrogation rooms. Elizabeth stood outside the door of the interrogation room, her body rigid with tension. This was it, the moment she would finally get the answers she had been desperately searching for. Detective Green turned to her as they prepared to start the interviews. "Elizabeth, this might be your last chance to learn the truth about what happened. But you have to be ready. What you hear in there could change everything." Elizabeth nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She was ready. She had to be. Inside the room, Daniel Webb sat slumped in a chair, his eyes bloodshot, his expression tired but defiant. Elizabeth couldn't help but stare at him as the officers began questioning him. She could feel the weight of his gaze as if he could sense her presence, even though she was on the other side of the glass. He didn't seem like the monster she had imagined. But then again, she had never known him before today. What kind of man was he really? The woman was brought in next. She was younger than Elizabeth had expected, maybe in her late 20s. Her face was pale, her eyes cold. She didn't look scared. In fact, she looked almost detached, as if this whole situation meant nothing to her. Detective Green sat across from her, his voice steady. "We know you were involved in the death of John Reynolds. We have evidence. And we know you were with Daniel Webb." The woman's lips twisted into a small smile, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was something darker. "John Reynolds. That's what he was to you, wasn't he? Just a man you married. A man who never told you the truth about who he really was." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she whispered, though no one could hear her. The woman turned her gaze toward the one-way mirror, and for a brief moment, Elizabeth could have sworn she saw something in her eyes. A glimmer of recognition, a hint of something. Could the woman know her? Was this woman somehow involved in the lies and secrets that had surrounded John's life? Before she could piece any of this together, the woman spoke again, her voice low and full of disdain. "I knew about John's past long before you did, sweetheart, and I've been waiting for the right moment to make him pay for what he did." Elizabeth's heart stopped. Make him pay? What did he do? Detective Green asked, his voice sharper now. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough," the woman replied with a dark smirk. "But not from me. Not yet." Elizabeth's mind was reeling. What was this woman talking about? What had John done that had led to his own death? John pulled his wife, Elizabeth, into the living room with trembling hands. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. He was gasping for air, each breath more frantic than the last. In his hand was the crumpled photograph, the one that had shattered his entire world in a single glance. Who are you?" His voice cracked, barely a whisper. Elizabeth stood there, frozen, her eyes fixed on his. She didn't move. Her lips parted, but no words came out. In the corner of the room, their wedding photos were scattered across the floor, their faces blurred by the shock of what John had just uncovered. The truth he hadn't seen until today. His new bride, the woman he had married only a few months ago, was not who she appeared to be. The picture in his hand showed the same face, but it was a version from a past long hidden. His pulse throbbed in his neck, his entire body trembling with rage. "You didn't just hide who you were. You kept me in the dark. For months. For months, you made me think you were someone else." Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She wanted to explain, to beg for his forgiveness, but the words got caught in her throat. She had known this moment was coming, but she never expected it to happen like this. John turned toward the door, his face contorted with disgust. "I want you gone. Now." Before Elizabeth could say anything else, before she could even make another move, a sharp noise echoed through the house. It was like a gunshot, loud and jarring, splitting the air between them. Elizabeth's eyes widened in horror as she saw the blood splatter across John's shirt, his body jerking violently, then collapsing to the floor. Her heart stopped. Her mind raced. Everything around her seemed to slow. It took a moment for her to realize what had just happened. John had been shot. The blood stained the floor as John's lifeless body lay there. Elizabeth could hardly breathe. She didn't know what had just occurred or how. Her eyes darted around the room, her thoughts in disarray. Had he been shot by someone else? Was there a stranger in the house? Or had it been her? But no, she hadn't touched the gun. She hadn't heard the shot coming. A distant siren wailed, and in that moment, Elizabeth knew she couldn't escape what was coming next. Elizabeth's mind raced as the distant sound of sirens grew louder. Panic settled deep in her chest, like a heavy stone pressing against her lungs. Her eyes darted from John's lifeless body to the door, but she didn't know where to go. She didn't know what to do. Every step she considered felt wrong, as though she was trapped in some twisted nightmare where every choice she made would lead her further into darkness. The blood on the floor seemed to spread out like an unforgiving stain, a reminder that everything had changed. The life they had built together, her love for him, the happiness they had shared, was now gone, just like that. With one act of violence, Elizabeth stumbled backward, her heart pounding. She barely noticed the sirens drawing closer, their wail cutting through the quiet of the house. Her mind was still reeling from the shock, from the terror that she might be blamed for what had happened. She hadn't done anything, had she? No, she hadn't. But the evidence was right there in front of her, in the crimson pool spreading across the floor. Her breathing grew shallow. She needed to think. She needed to figure out what had happened, how it had happened. But before she could even gather her thoughts, a loud crash came from the back of the house. The door to the kitchen had flown open. Elizabeth's heart leapt into her throat. She spun around just as two police officers burst into the living room, guns drawn, eyes scanning the room. "Freeze!" one of them shouted. She froze, her body rigid with fear. She didn't even think to move as they advanced, their eyes never leaving her for a second. One officer, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, approached cautiously, while the other stood by the door, watching her with suspicion. "What happened here?" the officer with the scar asked, his voice low, but his tone hard. Elizabeth swallowed. Her throat felt dry, her mouth too dry to speak. She tried to form words, but they came out as a strangled gasp. I didn't. Who shot him?" the officer demanded, cutting her off. "Was it you?" She felt the blood drain from her face. No, I didn't." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to us, lady. We know what happened here." The neighbors heard the shot. Elizabeth's thoughts were a mess, but she couldn't let herself panic. Not yet. She needed to stay calm, to stay in control. But how could she? Her husband, her new husband, was dead, and she had no idea who had killed him or why. "I swear, I didn't do it," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. "I don't even know what happened." The officer seemed to study her for a moment, his cold eyes piercing through her, weighing every word she spoke. Then he motioned to the other officer, who had been quietly searching the room, checking the corners, the furniture. The second officer stopped at the shelf, his eyes catching something. "Wait, we've got something here," the officer called out, his voice suddenly tense. Elizabeth's eyes followed the officer as he pulled something from the shelf. It was a small, silver handgun, tucked between a couple of books. The officer held it up, showing it to her. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know how it had gotten there. She didn't even know if it was the weapon that had killed John. The one with the scar seemed to consider her for a moment longer before speaking again. "You're coming with us," he said. "We'll sort this out at the station." Elizabeth's stomach churned. "But I didn't do anything. I swear." The officers didn't respond, merely motioning for her to move. Her legs felt like they might give out beneath her, but she somehow managed to walk with them, her mind spinning as she wondered what was going to happen next. How could she explain what had happened? What if they didn't believe her? What if they thought she was guilty? As the officers led her toward the door, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker was at play. She hadn't been the one to pull the trigger, but there was something about the situation that didn't sit right. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The door slammed behind her as they pushed her out into the cold, the flashing lights of the police cars surrounding her. But as they shoved her into the back of the patrol car, Elizabeth couldn't help but wonder. What if the truth was even worse than she imagined? The ride to the station was a blur. Elizabeth sat in the back of the patrol car, her hands tightly gripping the cold metal seat, her eyes focused on the flashing red and blue lights that danced across the windows. The sirens had long since faded into a steady hum, but the sound of her racing heartbeat filled her ears. She couldn't stop thinking about John. John, the love of her life, the man she had just married, the man who had died in front of her. But why? Why had he been killed? And why was she being dragged into this nightmare? Every time she closed her eyes, the image of him lying lifeless on the floor, his eyes wide open in shock, replayed over and over in her mind. It was as if she couldn't escape it. And now, she was in the back of a police car, her life unraveling in the blink of an eye. The officers didn't say a word to her during the ride, which only made the silence more suffocating. She had so many questions, so many things she needed to explain, but she didn't know where to start. Could they even hear her? Did they even care? When they finally pulled into the police station, Elizabeth was too numb to even register the cold air that hit her face as they dragged her from the car. They led her inside, down a long corridor lined with doors. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above her, making her head spin. She barely noticed the other officers, the prisoners in holding cells, the murmurs and whispers that filled the air. She was too consumed by her own confusion, her own fear. "Sit here," the officer with the scar said as he pointed to a chair in the interrogation room. Elizabeth sat down, her legs shaking beneath her. She couldn't help it. It was like she was trapped in some kind of twisted game she didn't understand. She had nothing to hide, but they made her feel guilty, like she was a criminal even though she didn't know what was going on. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Every second stretched longer than the last. She stared at the table in front of her, barely noticing when the door opened and another officer stepped in. "Name's Detective Green," the new officer said, his voice calm but firm. "We're gonna figure out what happened, but you need to help us understand." Elizabeth looked up at him, her eyes wide. She couldn't meet his gaze for long, so she let her eyes fall to her hands. "I didn't do it. I swear, I didn't kill John." The detective didn't seem surprised by her words. He nodded slowly, like he had expected her to say that. "We've got a lot of evidence pointing in your direction, Elizabeth. The gun we found in your living room, the blood everywhere. And the neighbors, well, they heard a loud argument just before the shot. Can you explain all that?" She shook her head, her heart racing. I didn't even know there was a gun in the house. I didn't hear an argument. Everything was fine. And then what?" Detective Green leaned forward, his piercing eyes locked onto hers. Elizabeth's chest tightened. She needed to tell him the truth. But how could she? Would he even believe her? "Then, I found the photograph," she said, her voice shaky. "The one where he was someone else. A man. Before he transitioned." The detective raised an eyebrow. "A transition? Are you telling me this is about some kind of secret?" Elizabeth nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "Yes. I didn't know. I didn't know anything about his past. And when I found that photo, I confronted him. I asked him about it. I didn't mean for things to go the way they did." "Did he threaten you?" Detective Green asked, his voice growing more intense. Elizabeth hesitated. The memory of the argument still felt fresh in her mind. John's anger, the shock in his eyes when she confronted him. "No, he didn't threaten me. He was just so upset. He didn't want me to know. And when I found out, everything changed." "And then what?" the detective pressed. "I don't know," Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what happened next. One moment, we were yelling, and the next, he was on the floor, dead." The detective stayed silent for a long moment, his eyes studying her. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to piece together the puzzle. But it didn't make sense. She wasn't guilty. She couldn't be. "Elizabeth, we're going to need more than just your word," the detective finally said. "The evidence is stacking up against you. We've got the gun. We've got the blood. And we've got the neighbors who heard the fight. If you didn't do it, then someone else did. But you need to tell us who." Elizabeth felt like the walls were closing in. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her thoughts were a mess, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't a murderer. She hadn't killed John. But if she didn't know what happened, how could she explain it to them? Before she could say another word, the door to the interrogation room burst open. The officer with the scar stepped in, his face pale. "Detective, you need to see this," he said urgently. The detective stood up immediately, his face growing grim. "What is it?" "Something's wrong," the officer said. "There's a new lead. We found something that doesn't make sense." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. What now? What could they have possibly found? Could it be the answers she was desperate to find? Elizabeth sat there, staring at the door as the two officers exchanged hurried words. She couldn't hear their exact conversation, but their serious tones were enough to tell her something big was happening. Her mind raced. The detective had already hinted at the mountain of evidence against her, and now there was something more. Something that was going to make everything even more complicated. She was left alone in the interrogation room, her thoughts swirling. She couldn't stop thinking about John. She couldn't stop seeing him in that pool of blood, unable to do anything to help him. Her chest tightened again as the minutes ticked by in agonizing silence. What could the officers have discovered? What else was there to know? She had tried to explain, but it was clear they weren't buying her story. Every word felt more hollow than the last. What if they didn't believe her? What if they were right and somehow she had killed John, even without realizing it? She closed her eyes, her head pounding. The door opened again, and Detective Green stepped inside, his face tense but focused. Elizabeth sat up straighter, her heart pounding in her throat. "We've been going over everything again," Detective Green said, his voice low. "We found something unexpected in the security footage from your house." Elizabeth blinked, her breath catching. "Security footage?" "Yes," he said, as he took a seat across from her. "We have cameras all over the property. Your neighbors have security systems, too, and the footage from those cameras tells us more than we expected." Elizabeth felt a sudden jolt of fear. She hadn't even thought about the cameras. She hadn't thought about what they might have caught. The detective studied her, his eyes narrowing. "The footage shows something different from what you've been telling us. The argument between you and John wasn't as one-sided as you made it seem." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "There was another person in the house," Detective Green said quietly. "Someone we didn't know about. And they were there when the shot was fired." Elizabeth froze, her blood running cold. "Another person? Who?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's what we need to figure out," the detective replied. "But there's one thing we're sure of now. You're not alone in this." Elizabeth shook her head in disbelief. "But I didn't. I don't know who else could be there." "We have the footage," the detective continued, "and it shows someone else entering your house before the shot. We can't identify them yet, but we're close." Elizabeth couldn't breathe. What did this mean? If someone else had been in the house, someone she hadn't seen, then was it possible John hadn't been killed by her? But who? Who was this mystery person? "I don't know who it is," she stammered. "I swear to you, detective, I didn't see anyone else. I was with John, and then he was on the floor. I don't know who did this." The detective leaned forward, his gaze softening for the first time. "I believe you, Elizabeth, but you need to stay calm. We have a long way to go before we figure out exactly what happened." Elizabeth felt her hands shake. She was still trapped in the web of confusion and fear. Whoever this person was, they had killed John. They had framed her, or at least it seemed that way. Could they have been in the house without her knowing? Was it someone from John's past? Someone who knew about his secret? Before Elizabeth could process any more, the officer with the scar came back into the room. He glanced at the detective, then looked at Elizabeth. "We've got a breakthrough," the officer said, his voice laced with urgency. "What is it?" Detective Green asked immediately. "We tracked down the person who was on the footage," the officer said. "We have their name, and it's someone close to both of them." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Close to both of them? Who could this person possibly be? The officer's eyes shifted to Elizabeth. "It's someone from John's past, someone who knew about his transition, and who might have had a reason to hurt him." Elizabeth stared at him, her mind reeling. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make any sense. Who was this person? And why would they want to hurt John? The officer held up a file in his hand. "We need to find them, and when we do, everything changes." Elizabeth felt a chill crawl up her spine. Who is it? Who is this person? The officer looked at her, his expression hardening. "It's someone named Daniel Webb, a former friend of John's, and someone who might have had a reason to seek revenge." Daniel Webb? The name didn't ring a bell, but the officer's words were enough to send a shiver through her. This person, whoever they were, was now tied to John's death. The detective stood up abruptly. "We need to move fast. If this person really did kill John, we need to bring them in before they can disappear." Elizabeth felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her mind raced with questions. Why had John kept this secret? Why hadn't he told her about Daniel Webb? And most importantly, who was this man? What was his connection to her husband? "Elizabeth," Detective Green said, looking at her seriously, "this might be your chance to clear your name. But you have to be honest with us. Everything about John's past. Everything you know. This could be the break we need."